The radio crackled with desperate voices as 12 enemy units spread across the rocky valley, hunting for a ghost. Their target wasn't some legendary warrior or seasoned commando. It was a 24-year-old woman who had vanished into the terrain like morning mist, leaving behind only the echo of precise gunshots and the growing fear in the hearts of battle-hardened soldiers. For 3 days, she had been picking them off one by one, not with reckless abandon, but with calculated precision that spoke of someone who understood the psychology of war better than the generals who sent these men to find her. Each shot wasn't just about eliminating a target. It was about sending a message that in this valley, death could come from anywhere at any time. The enemy had maps, radio communication, superior numbers, and air support on standby. She had only her rifle, her wits, and an intimate knowledge of every cave, ledge, and shadow in the unforgiving landscape that had become her hunting ground. What they didn't know was that this wasn't just about survival for her. This was about protecting something far more precious than her own life. As the sun began to set on what would become the most legendary game of cat and mouse in modern warfare, neither side knew that they were about to witness tactical brilliance that would be studied in military academies for decades to come. But in that moment, as the first shots rang out across the valley, only one thing was certain. By the time the dust settled, everything would change. Elena Vasquez never imagined that the hunting trips with her grandfather in the remote mountains of her homeland would one day save her life and the lives of countless others. Growing up in the small village of San Miguel, nestled between towering peaks and deep valleys, she learned to read the land like a book. Every rock formation, every change in wind direction, every bird call that seemed out of place. These were the lessons that would later prove invaluable when 12 enemy units descended upon her valley with orders to eliminate the resistance fighter who had been disrupting their supply lines. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Elena had been assigned to watch the northern approach to the valley, a task she had performed dozens of times over the past 6 months. The resistance cell she belonged to was small, but effective, consisting mostly of local villagers who knew the terrain better than any outside force ever could. They had been successfully sabotaging enemy convoys and communication lines, but their recent successes had drawn unwanted attention from high command. As she settled into her concealed position among the rocks, Elena adjusted her rifle scope and began her methodical scan of the approaches. The weapon itself was nothing special, a standard-issue rifle that had seen better days, but she had spent countless hours learning its quirks and limitations. Her grandfather had taught her that a gun was only as good as the person wielding it, and that patience was often more valuable than the finest equipment. The first sign of trouble came at dawn when she noticed the birds had stopped singing in the eastern sector. It was subtle, the kind of detail that most people would miss, but Elena had learned to pay attention to nature's early warning system. She shifted her position slightly and focused her scope on the rocky outcropping where the silence seemed most pronounced. Through her lens, she caught a glimpse of movement, the unmistakable profile of a soldier's helmet appearing briefly above a boulder. Her heart rate increased slightly, but her breathing remained steady. This was what she had been trained for, what months of preparation had led to. She began counting, moving her scope methodically from position to position, cataloging every movement and estimating the size of the force approaching her valley. What she discovered made her blood run cold. This wasn't the usual small patrol or even a reinforced squad. Through careful observation over the next hour, she identified at least 12 separate units positioning themselves throughout the valley. They were conducting a coordinated sweep, using tactics that spoke of careful planning and significant resources. Someone had decided that the resistance activities in this area warranted a major operation. Elena realized that her fellow resistance members, scattered throughout the valley in their various positions, were likely unaware of the scope of the threat approaching them. The enemy had clearly done their reconnaissance, positioning units to cover all the known escape routes and strategic positions. It was a well-executed trap designed to crush the local resistance once and for all. The smart move would have been to retreat immediately, to fade back into the mountains and live to fight another day. But Elena knew that her companions didn't know what was coming. Maria, the schoolteacher turned saboteur, was positioned near the old mining road. Carlos, barely 18 but deadly with explosives, was covering the southern approach. There were others too, good people who had risked everything to defend their home. As she watched the enemy units moving with military precision through her valley, Elena made a decision that would define not just the next few days, but the rest of her life. Instead of running, she would stay. Instead of hiding, she would hunt. She had advantages that the enemy couldn't possibly understand. Intimate knowledge of every cave and crevice in the surrounding terrain, the ability to move silently through countries she had explored since childhood, and, most importantly, the motivation that comes from defending your home. The first shot she fired wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to send a message. She had identified what appeared to be a command unit setting up a communications post near the valley center. Her bullet struck the radio equipment, sending sparks flying and causing the soldiers to dive for cover. The message was clear: your communications are compromised, and you are being watched. The reaction was immediate and predictable. The disciplined advance became a cautious crawl as units began looking for the source of the shot. Elena was already moving before the echo of her rifle had faded, using a network of concealed paths that she and her grandfather had used during their hunting expeditions. She reached her second position just as the enemy units began coordinating their response. Her next shot was more direct. She had identified an officer directing the search for her original position, recognizing the way other soldiers deferred to him and how he positioned himself to observe multiple approaches. The shot was clean and precise, eliminating not just a target, but a crucial link in their command structure. Before the body hit the ground, Elena was moving again. The psychological impact of her tactics became apparent within hours. The coordinated advance slowed to a crawl as units became increasingly cautious about exposing themselves. Every shadow might conceal a sniper. Every rock formation might hide a threat. The hunters were beginning to feel like the hunted, and Elena was just getting started. She used the terrain like a chess master uses the board, always thinking several moves ahead. The valley that the enemy saw as a tactical advantage, clear fields of fire and limited escape routes, Elena saw as a maze where she held every advantage. She knew which paths provided concealment, which positions offered the best fields of fire, and, most importantly, how to disappear completely when the situation required it. As the sun reached its peak, Elena had successfully disrupted the enemy's advance while eliminating two key targets. But, more importantly, she had bought time for her fellow resistance members to recognize the threat and either escape or reposition themselves. The radio chatter she intercepted through a capture device revealed growing frustration among the enemy commanders. The afternoon brought new challenges as the enemy began adapting to her tactics. They started moving in smaller groups, using more sophisticated communication protocols, and employing counter-sniping techniques. But Elena had anticipated this escalation. Her grandfather had often told her that the key to successful hunting wasn't just knowing your prey, but understanding how your prey would react when it realized it was being hunted. She shifted her strategy accordingly, focusing less on direct confrontation and more on psychological warfare. A shot that barely missed its target could be more effective than a kill, especially if it came from an unexpected direction. The goal was to create the impression that the valley itself was hostile, that death could come from any direction at any moment. By evening, the enemy units had established defensive positions throughout the valley, but their original mission, a swift sweep to eliminate the resistance, had been completely derailed. They were now focused on finding and eliminating a single sniper who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Elena had successfully transformed a battle against overwhelming odds into a more manageable game of cat and mouse. As darkness began to fall, Elena took stock of her situation. She had limited ammunition, no support, and 12 enemy units actively hunting her. But she also had advantages that couldn't be quantified on any military planning chart. Absolute knowledge of the terrain, the motivation that comes from defending one's home, and, most importantly, the patience to play a long game that her enemies couldn't afford to lose. The first day had been about disruption and establishing the rules of engagement. Tomorrow would be about demonstrating that in her valley, on her terms, she was not the prey but the predator. The enemy had brought superior numbers and equipment, but Elena had brought something far more dangerous, the determination of someone fighting for everything she held dear. The second day dawned with a thick mist that clung to the valley floor like a protective blanket. Elena had spent the night moving between carefully prepared positions, using natural caves and rock formations that provided both concealment and multiple escape routes. She had learned long ago that staying in one place too long was a death sentence, especially when facing a determined enemy with superior numbers. From her morning observation post, she could see that the enemy had adapted their tactics overnight. They had established a command post in what they considered a secure location, a cluster of large boulders that provided protection from multiple angles. What they didn't realize was that Elena had played in those same rocks as a child and knew about the narrow crevice that provided a perfect shooting lane from an elevated position they hadn't considered. The enemy's new strategy was methodical and professional. They had divided the valley into sectors and were conducting systematic sweeps, with each unit maintaining radio contact and supporting overlapping fields of fire. It was textbook counterinsurgency tactics, the kind of operation that should have been successful against a traditional opponent. But Elena was far from traditional. She observed their patterns for over an hour, noting how they communicated, where they positioned their lookouts, and, most importantly, how they reacted to perceived threats. The psychological impact of yesterday's actions was evident in their behavior. They moved more cautiously, spent more time scanning potential sniper positions, and showed signs of the stress that comes from knowing you're being hunted. Elena's first action of the day was designed to exploit their heightened state of alert. She fired a single shot from a position she had used the previous day, deliberately missing her target but hitting close enough to cause the entire unit to take cover and begin searching for her position. While they were focused on that location, she was already moving to a completely different area of the valley. The beauty of her strategy lay in its simplicity. By firing from a previous position, she reinforced the enemy's assumption that she was still operating from known locations. They would spend valuable time and resources searching an area she had already abandoned, while she positioned herself to strike from an entirely unexpected direction. Her real target was the communications specialist she had identified in the command unit. Taking out their communications would force them to rely on less secure methods and make coordination between units more difficult. But more importantly, it would demonstrate that their supposedly secure positions were anything but safe. The shot was challenging, over 400 meters through difficult terrain with wind conditions that required careful calculation. Elena took her time, controlling her breathing and heart rate the way her grandfather had taught her during their hunting expeditions. When she finally squeezed the trigger, the bullet found its mark with devastating precision. The reaction was immediate chaos. The command post erupted in activity as soldiers scrambled to identify the source of the shot, while also dealing with their wounded communications specialist. Elena was already moving, using the noise and confusion to mask her withdrawal to the next position. What happened next demonstrated the true genius of her approach. Instead of immediately seeking a new target, she fired another shot from a completely different direction, not at personnel but at equipment. Her bullet destroyed a radio antenna, further degrading their communications capability. Then, before they could respond to this new threat, she was gone again. The psychological impact was exactly what she had intended. The enemy now realized they were facing an opponent who could strike from multiple directions almost simultaneously. The valley that had seemed like a contained tactical environment now felt like a maze where death could come from any angle. Elena spent the rest of the morning playing this deadly game of misdirection. She would fire from one position, then appear somewhere completely different before the enemy could coordinate a response. Each shot was carefully planned, not just for its immediate tactical value, but for its psychological impact on the entire enemy force. By midday, the systematic sweep had broken down completely. Units were moving more defensively, spending more time in cover and less time advancing. Radio chatter revealed growing frustration among the commanders and increasing anxiety among the rank-and-file soldiers. The mission that was supposed to have been completed in hours was now stretching into its second day with minimal progress. Elena used this breakdown in their discipline to her advantage. She identified a unit that had become separated from the others during their frantic search for her positions. Unlike the larger groups, this smaller unit was more vulnerable, but also more mobile and harder to predict. It would require a different approach. She spent over an hour tracking their movement, learning their patterns, and identifying the leader. Military units she had observed often reflected the personality and decision-making style of their commanders. This particular group seemed more aggressive and less cautious than the others, suggesting a leader who prioritized action over careful planning. When she finally engaged them, it was with a series of rapid shots from multiple positions. The technique was exhausting and required precise timing, but it created the illusion of multiple snipers working in coordination. The unit, already on edge from hours of fruitless searching, broke formation and began a disorganized retreat toward what they hoped would be more secure terrain. Elena followed at a distance, picking her shots carefully. Her goal wasn't to eliminate the entire unit. That would be impossible with her limited ammunition, but to drive them toward a specific area where she could maximize the psychological impact of her actions. She had identified a narrow canyon that would force them into a predictable path, while providing her with multiple firing positions. The chase through the canyon became a masterclass in tactical psychology. Elena's shots were precisely timed to keep the unit moving forward while preventing them from establishing any defensive positions. Each bullet came from a different angle, creating the impression that they were surrounded by multiple shooters. The reality was far simpler. One woman who knew every inch of the terrain, using that knowledge to devastating effect. When a unit finally reached what they thought was safety, a wider area of the canyon with better defensive positions, Elena was ready with her most ambitious plan yet. She had pre-positioned reflective surfaces in strategic locations, pieces of metal, and glass that would create muzzle flashes when struck by sunlight. Combined with the acoustic properties of the canyon walls, she could create the illusion of gunfire coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The execution required perfect timing and a deep understanding of how sound and light would behave in the specific environment. When Elena fired her real shot, eliminating another key target, the reflective surfaces created false muzzle flashes throughout the canyon. The acoustic echoes made it impossible for the survivors to determine which of the apparent shots had been real. The psychological break was complete. The remaining members of the unit abandoned their positions and fled the canyon in complete disarray, spreading their panic to other units through fragmented radio communications. Word began to spread throughout the enemy force that they were facing not a single sniper, but a coordinated team of ghost-like opponents who could appear and disappear at will. Elena returned to her observation positions as afternoon turned to evening, monitoring radio communications and assessing the day's impact. The enemy had not only failed to make progress in their sweep, but had actually lost ground as units became more defensive and less coordinated. More importantly, the psychological pressure was beginning to show in their communications. References to multiple contacts, coordinated attacks, and unknown number of hostiles appeared repeatedly in their reports. As darkness approached, Elena began preparing for what she knew would be a crucial night. The enemy would likely attempt to use the cover of darkness to reposition their forces and possibly call for additional support. She needed to maintain the pressure while also conserving her increasingly precious ammunition for the challenges that lay ahead. The second day had been about demonstrating the futility of their conventional tactics and establishing her dominance over the tactical environment. Tomorrow would be about turning their strengths into weaknesses and showing them that superior numbers meant nothing when your opponent could see you but remain invisible herself. Elena settled into her night position, a carefully selected location that provided observation of multiple approach routes while offering several escape options. The enemy had brought their war to her valley, but with each passing hour, it became more apparent that they had entered a contest where the rules favored the defender who truly understood the game being played. The third day brought new challenges and opportunities that would test every skill Elena had developed over months of resistance fighting and years of learning the valley secrets. During the night, she had intercepted radio communications indicating that the enemy was calling for air support and additional ground reinforcements. The local commander was clearly frustrated with the lack of progress and ready to escalate the situation significantly. Elena knew that the arrival of air support would change the tactical situation completely. Helicopters and reconnaissance aircraft would eliminate many of her advantages, making it nearly impossible to move undetected during daylight hours. She needed to accomplish something decisive before the additional assets arrived, something that would either end the engagement entirely or force the enemy to reconsider their approach. From her pre-dawn observation position, she watched as the enemy forces implemented what appeared to be a new strategy. Instead of the systematic sweep of the previous day, they were establishing static positions with overlapping fields of fire, essentially turning the valley into a kill zone designed to prevent any movement. It was a defensive strategy masquerading as an offensive one, and Elena recognized it as a sign that she had successfully shifted the psychological balance of the engagement. The enemy was no longer hunting her. They were trying to contain her until their reinforcements could arrive. This represented both a tactical victory and a strategic challenge. She had successfully disrupted their original mission, but now faced the prospect of being overwhelmed by superior numbers and technology within hours. Elena spent the early morning hours conducting what she privately called a target assessment survey. Using a combination of direct observation and intercepted communications, she identified the key personnel and equipment that kept the enemy force functional. The new defensive positions, while providing better protection for individual soldiers, had forced the command elements to consolidate in predictable locations. Her analysis revealed several critical vulnerabilities. The command post had been relocated to what the enemy considered an impregnable position, a natural fortress of rocks that provided excellent protection from direct fire. But Elena's childhood explorations had revealed that the position had a significant blind spot accessible through a series of small caves and crevices that would be invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. The approach would be extremely dangerous, requiring her to move through areas with limited cover while carrying all her equipment. More challenging still, the route would take her very close to several enemy positions, requiring perfect timing and absolute silence. But if successful, she could strike at the heart of their command structure from a completely unexpected direction. Elena began her approach during the mid-morning hours when the sun's position would create shadows that favored her movement. She had stripped down to essential equipment, only her rifle, a minimal amount of ammunition, and basic survival gear. Everything else was cached in positions throughout the valley for potential later recovery. The journey through the cave system was both physically demanding and mentally challenging. Some passages required crawling through spaces barely wider than her shoulders, while others involved climbing over loose rock that could betray her position with a single misplaced step. Her childhood familiarity with these hidden routes proved invaluable, allowing her to navigate in near-complete darkness while maintaining her sense of direction and progress. After nearly 2 hours of careful movement, Elena reached her target position, a concealed ledge that provided a clear view of the enemy command post from an angle they had never considered. Through her scope, she could see the senior officers coordinating the defensive positions and planning for the arrival of their reinforcements. More importantly, she could see the communication equipment that kept their scattered units coordinated. The shot would need to be perfect. At this range and angle, she would have only one opportunity before her position was compromised and the approach route she had used became a death trap. Elena took her time, studying the wind patterns around the rocky formations and calculating the precise adjustments needed for the challenging shot angle. When she finally fired, the bullet struck the primary communications console with devastating precision, sending sparks flying and destroying weeks' worth of coordination equipment in an instant. But Elena wasn't finished. As the command post erupted in confusion, she fired 3 more carefully aimed shots, systematically destroying backup communications equipment and eliminating key personnel with surgical precision. The psychological impact was immediate and dramatic. The enemy's carefully coordinated defensive positions suddenly became isolated outposts with limited ability to communicate or coordinate their actions. Radio chatter exploded with confusion, conflicting orders, and growing panic as units tried to understand what had happened to their command structure. Elena was already moving through her extraction route as the enemy began their frantic search for the source of the devastating attack. Her childhood knowledge of the cave system allowed her to disappear completely while enemy soldiers scoured the area around the command post, searching for firing positions that simply didn't exist from their perspective. By early afternoon, Elena had reached a new observation position that allowed her to assess the impact of her morning's work. The enemy force was in complete disarray. Without effective communications, the individual units had become increasingly defensive and isolated. Some were attempting to relocate to positions with better visibility, while others were hunkering down and waiting for orders that might never come. The breakdown in command and control created new opportunities for tactical exploitation. Elena identified several units that had become effectively cut off from the main force during the confusion following her attack on the command post. These isolated groups were more vulnerable, but also more unpredictable, making them both easier and more dangerous targets. Her next series of engagements demonstrated the full evolution of her tactical approach. Instead of the direct shooting of the first day or the psychological warfare of the second, she now employed what military theorists would later describe as systemic disruption, attacks designed to collapse the enemy's ability to function as a coordinated force. Elena began targeting the soldiers responsible for maintaining equipment and coordinating logistics. These weren't always the most obvious targets, but their elimination created cascading effects that degraded the enemy's overall capabilities. A radio operator's death might seem less significant than eliminating an officer, but it could isolate an entire unit from the larger force. She also began using the terrain in increasingly creative ways, employing techniques that went beyond traditional sniping. By triggering small rockfalls in strategic locations, she could force enemy units to relocate to less favorable positions. By using the acoustic properties of the valley to mask her movements, she could appear to be in multiple locations simultaneously. The afternoon brought evidence that her psychological warfare was achieving its intended effect. Intercepted radio communications revealed growing dissent among the enemy ranks, with some units requesting permission to withdraw from the valley entirely. References to ghost fighters' supernatural accuracy and impossible shots began appearing in their communications. Elena realized that she had reached a critical point in the engagement. The enemy force was psychologically defeated, but still possessed superior numbers and firepower. The arrival of air support could quickly reverse all her tactical gains, making it essential to maintain pressure while preparing for a potential escalation. As evening approached, Elena intercepted communications indicating that the helicopter support had been delayed due to weather conditions in their staging area. This provided her with additional time to complete what she privately called Phase 3 of her defensive strategy, demonstrating to the enemy that even their supposedly secure positions were vulnerable to someone who truly understood the battlefield. Her final action of the day was perhaps the most audacious yet. Elena infiltrated to within 50 meters of the enemy's most heavily defended position, a natural choke point that they had fortified with multiple weapon systems and overlapping fields of fire. From this impossibly close range, she eliminated two key defenders and destroyed their primary weapon emplacement before disappearing back into the landscape like a ghost. The message was unmistakable. Nowhere in the valley was safe, no position was impregnable, and the enemy was facing an opponent who played by rules they couldn't understand or counter. As darkness fell on the third day, Elena had transformed a conventional military operation into a psychological nightmare that was beginning to consume the enemy force from within. The third day had been about demonstrating complete tactical dominance and breaking the enemies will to continue the engagement. Tomorrow would determine whether her psychological warfare had been sufficient to end the threat, or whether the arrival of additional forces would require her to escalate to even more desperate measures. The fourth day arrived with the distant sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the morning air, confirming Elena's worst fears. The enemy had finally received their air support, fundamentally changing the tactical situation and threatening to eliminate the advantages she had so carefully cultivated over the previous 3 days. From her concealed position, she watched as two attack helicopters circled the valley, conducting reconnaissance flights that would soon reveal her carefully prepared positions and escape routes. Elena knew that conventional wisdom would dictate immediate retreat. Against air support and reinforced ground units, a lone sniper had virtually no chance of success. But conventional wisdom had never accounted for someone with her unique combination of local knowledge, tactical creativity, and absolute determination to defend her home. Instead of retreating, she began implementing a plan she had hoped would never be necessary. A strategy so dangerous that it would either end the engagement decisively or cost her everything. During the previous night, Elena had prepared what she privately called her final gambit, a series of improvised explosive devices created from materials cached throughout the valley during months of resistance activities. These weren't sophisticated weapons, but rather simple devices designed to create maximum psychological impact while taking advantage of the valley's unique acoustic and geological properties. The plan required her to abandon many of the safety protocols that had kept her alive for 3 days. Instead of maintaining distance and mobility, she would need to position herself in close proximity to major enemy concentrations and remain in exposed locations long enough to coordinate a complex sequence of events. It was, by any reasonable measure, a suicide mission disguised as a tactical operation. Elena's first action was to use the helicopter reconnaissance flights to her advantage. By carefully timing her movements, she could use the noise and distraction of the aircraft to mask her approach to positions that would have been impossible to reach undetected under normal circumstances. The helicopters, designed to reveal her locations, became unwitting cover for her most audacious infiltration attempt yet. She reached a position directly above the largest concentration of enemy forces, a natural amphitheater where 3 separate units had established a consolidated defensive position. From her elevated vantage point, she could see nearly 30 soldiers, multiple vehicle-mounted weapons, and communication equipment that represented the backbone of their remaining command structure. The shot she fired wasn't aimed at personnel or equipment. It was aimed at a carefully prepared explosive device that she had positioned during her night movements. The device was small and carefully concealed, but its detonation in the rocky environment created a cascading rockfall that sent tons of stone crashing down into the enemy position. The effect was devastating, both tactically and psychologically. The rockfall eliminated several soldiers and destroyed critical equipment, but more importantly, it demonstrated that Elena could literally bring the valley itself down upon her enemies. The natural fortress that the enemy had considered impregnable had become a death trap activated by a single precisely placed shot. As the helicopters rushed toward the site of the explosion, Elena was already implementing the next phase of her plan. She had identified the patterns of their aerial reconnaissance and calculated the timing needed to move between positions without detection. Using a combination of natural cover and carefully timed movements, she reached her next objective while the aircraft were focused on the scene of devastation she had just created. Her second device was positioned near what remained of their primary command post. This explosion was smaller, but more precisely targeted, destroying the last of their major communication equipment and eliminating the senior officers who had been coordinating the multi-day operation. With their command structure now completely shattered, the individual enemy units were effectively isolated and operating without clear leadership or coordination. Elena's use of the valley's acoustic properties reached its peak during this phase of the engagement. By timing her explosions to take advantage of natural echo chambers and sound reflection patterns, she created the illusion of simultaneous attacks occurring throughout the valley. The enemy forces, already demoralized by days of psychological pressure, began reporting coordinated assaults by large numbers of resistance fighters. The helicopter crews, faced with what appeared to be a major uprising involving multiple explosive devices and coordinated attacks, began calling for additional support and ground reinforcements. Their reports painted a picture of a well-organized insurgent force that bore no resemblance to the reality of a single woman with improvised weapons and an intimate knowledge of the local terrain. Elena's third major action of the day demonstrated the full extent of her tactical evolution. Instead of targeting the enemy directly, she began targeting the valley itself, using small explosive charges to trigger landslides, collapse access routes, and create obstacles that would prevent reinforcement while making evacuation increasingly difficult. The psychological impact of watching their environment turn against them proved to be the breaking point for many enemy soldiers. Radio communications began revealing open discussions of retreat, with unit leaders requesting permission to withdraw from what they now perceived as an untenable position. The valley that had been selected for a straightforward counterinsurgency operation had become a nightmare landscape where the terrain itself seemed to be fighting against them. By midday, Elena had successfully isolated the remaining enemy forces into 3 separate groups with limited ability to communicate or coordinate their actions. Each group was trapped in a different section of the valley by the obstacles she had created, making unified action impossible while maximizing their psychological isolation and fear. The helicopter crews, initially confident in their ability to provide decisive support, found themselves operating in an environment that negated many of their advantages. The rocky terrain limited their landing options, while the acoustic chaos Elena had created made it difficult to distinguish between real and false targets. More critically, the apparent coordination of ground-based attacks suggested an enemy force capable of sophisticated anti-aircraft tactics. Elena's final major engagement of the day targeted the most psychologically vulnerable of the isolated groups, a unit that had been separated from the main force during the morning's chaos and had spent hours watching their comrades fall victim to seemingly impossible attacks. She approached to within close range of their position and engaged them with a combination of precise shooting and psychological manipulation. By firing from multiple positions in rapid succession, she created the impression of being surrounded by multiple snipers. The unit, already traumatized by 3 days of constant pressure, broke completely and attempted a disorganized retreat toward what they hoped would be safer terrain. Elena followed at a distance, using carefully placed shots to guide their movement toward a dead-end canyon where they would be effectively trapped. The helicopter pilots, observing this running engagement from above, saw what appeared to be a coordinated pursuit by multiple ground forces. Their attempts to provide close air support were frustrated by Elena's use of terrain features and timing, making it impossible to engage her positions without risking friendly fire incidents with their own ground forces. As afternoon turned to evening, Elena had achieved what military analysts would later describe as the impossible. A single defender had not only stopped a superior enemy force, but had effectively destroyed their ability to function as a coherent military unit. The 12 enemy units that had entered her valley with confidence and superior numbers were now scattered, demoralized, and unable to coordinate their actions. The radio communications she intercepted revealed the full extent of their psychological collapse. References to overwhelming enemy numbers, sophisticated explosive devices, and coordinated multi-directional attacks painted a picture that bore no resemblance to the reality of one woman with a rifle and a handful of improvised weapons. Elena's success on the fourth day had been achieved through a combination of tactical innovation, psychological manipulation, and an willingness to take risks that would have been considered suicidal under normal circumstances. She had transformed the enemy's advantages, superior numbers, air support, and modern equipment, into liabilities by forcing them to operate in an environment where those advantages became irrelevant. As darkness approached, Elena monitored the increasingly frantic radio communications of her enemies while preparing for what she hoped would be the final phase of the engagement. The fourth day had been about demonstrating that even with reinforcements and air support, the enemy could not achieve their objectives against a defender who understood both the terrain and the psychology of warfare better than their military doctrine had prepared them for. The fifth day dawned with an eerie silence that spoke louder than any gunfire ever could. Elena observed from her final prepared position as the scattered remnants of the enemy force began what could only be described as a full retreat. The psychological warfare she had waged over the previous 4 days had achieved what superior firepower and tactical planning had failed to accomplish: the complete breakdown of enemy morale and unit cohesion. Through her scope, Elena watched as the surviving members of what had once been 12 confident military units struggled to coordinate an orderly withdrawal. Their movements were hesitant and fearful, with soldiers constantly scanning the rocky landscape for threats that might materialize from any direction. The hunters had become the hunted, and the transformation was evident in every aspect of their behavior. The helicopter pilots, who had arrived with such confidence the previous day, were now conducting their reconnaissance flights at much higher altitudes, clearly reluctant to venture too close to the valley floor where their mechanical advantage could be negated by the terrain and the psychological pressure that had claimed so many of their ground-based colleagues. Elena's radio intercepts revealed the full extent of their demoralization. Communications between units were filled with references to strategic withdrawal, tactical repositioning, and regrouping at secure positions, military euphemisms for what was clearly a retreat born of fear rather than tactical necessity. The official reports being transmitted to higher command painted a picture of successful operations against significant enemy forces and sophisticated insurgent networks, bearing no resemblance to the reality of their defeat by a single determined defender. As the morning progressed, Elena made a decision that would define her legacy as much as her tactical brilliance had over the previous 4 days. Instead of pursuing the retreating forces or attempting to inflict additional casualties, she allowed them to withdraw unmolested. This wasn't mercy, it was strategic thinking of the highest order. Living witnesses to the impossible defeat they had suffered would spread the story far more effectively than additional casualties ever could. The message she chose to send was clear and unmistakable. By allowing the retreat to proceed without interference, Elena demonstrated that she had never been trapped or desperate, but had been in control of the situation from the very beginning. The enemy withdrawal wasn't an escape from an impossible situation. It was permission granted by someone who could have prevented it entirely if she had chosen to do so. Elena's final radio transmission of the engagement was broadcast on the enemy's own communication frequencies, a simple message delivered in their own language. The valley remembers everything, and the valley protects its own. Tell your commanders that some places are worth more than the cost of taking them. The transmission was brief, but its impact on the retreating forces was profound. Many would later report that hearing her voice transformed their understanding of the entire engagement. As the last of the enemy forces disappeared beyond the valley's ridgeline, Elena began the process of emerging from her role as a ghost warrior and returning to her identity as a defender of her community. She spent the remainder of the day visiting the positions where her fellow resistance members had been stationed, confirming their safety and coordinating their return to the valley now that the immediate threat had passed. The reunion with her comrades revealed the true scope of what she had accomplished. Maria, the schoolteacher turned saboteur, had spent 4 days hiding in caves, listening to the sounds of battle, and wondering if she would ever see her home again. Carlos, the young explosives expert, had managed to evade detection, but had been unable to contribute to the defense due to the overwhelming enemy presence. Others had similar stories of fear, isolation, and helplessness in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Elena's account of the previous 4 days was met with initial disbelief that gradually transformed into awe as the evidence of her actions became apparent. The destroyed enemy positions, the collapsed access routes, and the scattered equipment told a story of tactical brilliance that seemed impossible for a single person to have achieved. But the evidence was undeniable, and Elena's modest recounting of her actions only added to the growing legend of what had transpired in their valley. The broader implications of Elena's victory became apparent in the days that followed. Intelligence reports indicated that the enemy force that had retreated from the valley had been permanently withdrawn from active operations, with many of its members requesting transfers to other theaters of operation. The official reports filed by the surviving officers made no mention of being defeated by a single sniper, instead describing a strategic withdrawal in the face of overwhelming enemy numbers and sophisticated defensive preparations. More significantly, enemy operations throughout the region showed a marked change in character. The confident, aggressive sweeps that had characterized their previous tactics were replaced by more cautious, defensive approaches that reflected a new understanding of the risks involved in operating in terrain where the local population possessed intimate knowledge and absolute determination to resist. Elena's tactical innovations began appearing in resistance operations throughout the country as word of her success spread through underground networks. Her use of psychological warfare, terrain manipulation, and the systematic targeting of command and communication systems became standard tactics taught in clandestine training camps. But more importantly, her demonstration that superior numbers and equipment could be defeated by superior knowledge and determination became a source of inspiration for resistance fighters facing seemingly impossible odds. The valley itself bore permanent scars from the engagement, rock falls, and collapsed passages that served as monuments to the battle that had taken place there. But these scars also became part of the landscape's protective features, creating natural obstacles that would make any future military operations more difficult, while serving as constant reminders of the price of attempting to occupy territory defended by people fighting for their homes and families. Elena returned to her life in San Miguel, but the woman who emerged from the valley was fundamentally changed by her experience. The shy hunter who had learned marksmanship from her grandfather had become a tactical genius whose innovations would be studied in military academies for decades to come. But perhaps more importantly, she had demonstrated that the human spirit, when properly motivated and intelligently applied, could overcome advantages that appeared insurmountable on paper. Years later, military historians would analyze Elena's victory as a case study in asymmetric warfare and the importance of terrain knowledge in tactical planning. Her use of psychological operations, systematic targeting of command structures, and innovative application of improvised weapons became textbook examples of how individual defenders could achieve strategic objectives against superior forces. But for the people of San Miguel and the broader resistance movement, Elena's victory represented something far more important than tactical innovation. She had proven that their valley, their home, and their way of life were worth defending regardless of the odds. In 4 days of impossible courage and brilliant tactical thinking, she had transformed from a village girl who liked to hunt with her grandfather into a legend who would inspire generations of fighters determined to protect what they held most dear. The ghost who had vanished into the valley's shadows had emerged victorious, not through superior firepower or numbers, but through superior understanding of what it truly meant to fight for home. The enemy had brought their war to her valley, but Elena had taught them that some places and Some people simply could not be conquered, only respected from a safe distance. In the end, Elena Vasquez had achieved the ultimate victory in asymmetric warfare. She had made her enemies afraid to return, while inspiring her allies to believe that no cause was hopeless as long as someone was willing to stand and fight for it. The valley would remember everything, and Elena had made sure that the memory would protect her people long after the echoes of gunfire had faded into legend.